Dr. Karyl McBride, it is such a pleasure to have you on the Drinking with Gin podcast today. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Ginny. I appreciate the invite and I'm happy to be here.
All right, so let me give a little bit of background and context. And before I do that, we always start every episode with, what are you drinking? Are you sipping on anything while we have our chat here today?
I wish I was drinking some gin and tonic or something to fit the show, but I'm drinking water because it's the middle of my workday.
Same. I'm also drinking water. So we are in good company. Maybe we can have a little gin and tonic or a little cocktail a little bit later today to celebrate our conversation. We'll cheers virtually. But Jem, whatever you're sipping along as you listen along to this conversation with Dr. Karyl McBride, I hope that it's tasty and enjoyable. We are in for a real treat here today. So I want to give you a little context of how Dr. McBride came on the podcast today. So if you've been here listening along for a while, or maybe you just joined because we had Dr. Alina Kastner from Vienna, Austria. And she's a psychotherapist in Vienna, and she has blown up on TikTok, like millions and millions of views. She's so relatable, really specializes in narcissism. And she shared in her stories a copy of Dr. McBride's book. Don't mind all of my tags. We're going to get to all of this. There's so much good content in this book. This book called Will I Ever Be Good Enough? And if you've ever asked yourself that question, I mean, you'll relate to this episode. I just think there's so much. And I know the subtitle is Healing the Daughters of Narcissistic Mothers, which I hate to say that I'm in that category, but I am. I'm part of that club. But I picked up this book because she recommended it. And I don't even think I got through one full chapter. And I was like, this is so good. I have to get Dr. McBride. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to get her on the podcast. And you were so warm and gracious to come on immediately. You said yes. And we started the conversations and eventually figured out a day and time that would work. So thank you for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about where your own passion for this work stemmed from?
Yes, I was in graduate school and, beginning to study psychology. And I'm very interested in family systems and family systems work in the therapy field. And I knew that I had come from an alcoholic family because that information was out there, and there are many books on it. But I knew there was something else that was going on in the family system, and I couldn't put my finger on it. And eventually figured out the narcissism angle. But at that time, there was nothing in the field that was really written for the lay public about narcissism and the effects of narcissism on intimate relationships or children of narcissists. So I began research, and I did research for years before I wrote my first book in 2008, which is the one you mentioned, Will I Ever Be Good Enough?
So it really stemmed from your own experience in your family situation and digging into uncovering and discovering that there was some narcissism within your own family unit, your family of origin.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes. And I don't talk a lot about my own family because many of them are still living, but I do talk about my own experience with it, as I do in the books.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start there. And thank you for saying that. It's a tricky situation and scenario when you do come from a family of origin. I have gotten to a point where I've become very open in sharing, and I'm starting to see some celebrities become more open about sharing. someone just sent me a TikTok. I forget who it was, but it's a big name. It's Mayim Balik, I think, just opened up, and Kristen Cavallari, she just opened up about her, going no contact with her own father because of narcissism. And I've opened up about going no contact with my own mom. I have a whole podcast episode on it called My Hardest Breakup, because it really is. And you provide such beautiful context in this book. And so I actually, a few years ago, was having a conversation with a colleague, and her mom had passed. Um, but she was describing her in a way, all of the tendencies and behaviors sounded extremely narcissistic. And so we were having this conversation, and because I'm curious, and this is the line of work that I do now, I'm not a therapist and a psychologist like you are, but I did study psychology in college, and like I'm just very interested and fascinated by all this. So I started asking questions. I was like, "Oh, do you think?" And she kind of snapped at me. And she said, "Oh, well, she's dead. I'm not going there, da da da." And that's fine, right? Like everyone's journey is their own. But to that point, what I think is really beautiful about the way you wrote this book is you're not necessarily diagnosing someone and saying, "Oh, your mom's a narcissist. Here's the problem." You do it in such an eloquent way that helps people pull out different components that they might relate to, that might help give them a better understanding for their own recovery from narcissism and trauma. And it's such a beautiful way. And before we started recording, I shared with you that I sent my sister, there's a really nice, I love checklists. So if you have ever heard of Joe Navarro, he's a former FBI agent, his book Dangerous Personalities, it has a lot of checklists in it. So I loved that you had a checklist. I think it's so helpful for people. And I sent it to my sister, and she was like, "Well, that was a test that I wasn't trying to do really well on. I wasn't trying to get a high score." But it's just, there's so many helpful things in here. So thank you for the work that you do to help provide so much support and validation for adult children of narcissists. So let's get into some of the nitty gritty in the book. I made a bunch of notes, like you saw my tabs in the book. One of the things that you said is that because this one does focus on healing daughters of narcissistic mothers, and one of the components that you talk about is how underrepresented narcissist women often are. Why do you think that is? Or what is kind of the story or the reasoning behind that?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Underrepresented in what way?
I think, and perhaps it's around, so often we associate narcissists with men.
Oh, I see. I see. You mean that women or mothers could possibly be narcissists?
Yes. And so I think I think in society too, you talk about how, so maybe these two things we can loop in together. You talk about how motherhood socially is idolized.
Right.
And
Exactly.
there's
Yeah.
that whole thing of, well, it's your mom. How can you not talk to your mom? And as someone that is that has chosen to go no contact, sometimes it feels like there's almost like a stigma, right? Like, well, it's your mom. You should have a relationship with her. And I think part of it, like you were saying, is like, oh, well, we kind of associate that with men.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand right off the bat that narcissism is a spectrum disorder. And so, you have to think of it as a spectrum where on one end, we all have some narcissistic traits that are normal, and then people who have more and more traits that move along the spectrum. Over here on the far end is the narcissistic personality disorder. So many people can have traits along this continuum and still do damage to their children. But yes, it's interesting what you say about mothers. I mean, motherhood, as you say, is a one of the biggest celebrated holidays in the world, really. And it is our deep desire for all of us. It's almost primal that we want a mommy, that a mommy should be there, that we should be able to lay our head on mommy's breast and mommy will be there for us. And it's a very difficult thing, I think, for people who have narcissistic parents, particularly we're talking now about mothers, but either mother or father, to not have that idealized stereotype or archetype of this saintly person, that mother is supposed to be.
Yeah, and like what you're talking about are those primal needs of a child, right? Like seeking that physical touch and comfort and unconditional love.
Right.
And at the root, that's really what being a parent is giving your children unconditional love.
Yes.
And when you don't receive that as a child, like you just explained, there are things that can be really damaging, right? Can be traumatic, can cause that damage along the way. And it might seem simple to most people, like, well, obviously that's what you do is unconditional love. But try talking to somebody that didn't receive that.
Yeah,
It's a very different story and experience.
it is. And it's also a story that for people who did have it, don't understand it very well. You hear adult children of narcissists saying a lot that other people are, constantly saying to them, the past is the past, get over it already. What are you talking about? It can't be that bad. Um, and so it's still, I think, Ginny, not that well understood yet in our culture that children of narcissists really do suffer complex post-traumatic stress disorder and a lot of, internalized trauma from not having their needs met in each developmental stage that they go through in childhood.
Absolutely. You just said so much in those little couple sentences. So, one of the things that when I shared in my story, my first book, I know I'd shared this with you before we started in You're My Favorite. That's about my story about the shocking and traumatic end to a romantic relationship with I'm not going to diagnose him here or anything, but a narcissistic, predatory, sociopathic psychopath. Um, wow, right? That's a lot. But that, some people will, write a review and be like, it was just a breakup. But to me, that was the straw that broke the camel's back that made me realize everything about my CPTSD and that complex trauma that I had been experiencing my whole life. And that's what kind of brought everything to a head and made me really be able to start that road to recovery from those traumatic experiences. And if we can just go back for a second, I don't normally do this, but and I think this ties into very much what you were saying about the early needs of children and when they're not met. So on page 7, I'm just going to read a couple sentences. In your book, it says, a daughter who doesn't receive validation from her earliest relationship with her mother learns that she has no significance in the world and her efforts have no effect. She tries her hardest to make a genuine connection with mom, but fails and thinks that the problem of rarely being able to please her mother lies within herself. This teaches the daughter that she is unworthy of love. I'm,
Yes.
I am, I've marked that. I noted it. I've read it multiple times, and I still am on the verge of tears when I read that because I can relate. But if you're listening to this and you can relate to any component of that, like my heart breaks for women and people that have had this experience because everyone is worthy of love. But the way that you describe this makes so much sense.
Mhm. Yes, and it makes me think, Ginny, of the title of the book, Will I Ever Be Good Enough? Because that's what happens. You know, people say, if my own mother can't love me, who can? Who will? It's such a deep, deep longing. And the will I ever be good enough message is something that even when people do lots and lots of trauma work, which many of my clients do, um, it still feels like that will I ever be good enough or I'm not good enough is almost like it's an old wired message in the brain that is very, very difficult to reverse. And so it's an issue that people constantly are working on, or an issue that constantly gets triggered easily, because we're not encouraged to have, if you grow up in a narcissistic family led by a narcissistic parent, we're not encouraged to have a solid sense of self. We're not being encouraged to be our authentic, wonderful self. We're there to fit the script of the narcissistic family, the perfect image, what is expected of us. And so there's not that individual, you know, you're cool for who you are, not how you make us look, which is how narcissists operate. And so daughters and sons of narcissistic parents grow up with that internalized message of I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, and with what I call crippling self-doubt,
Mm.
because the very reality of the child is not validated in the narcissistic family. It's not it with because of the lack of empathy, the child's feelings are not validated.
And I think that's such a hot topic right now too, right? Especially we hear the term like toxic positivity. And I think growing up, right, being told, oh, Ginny, don't cry, which basically is telling a child, don't have feelings, right? And so you have to then, you know, and there, for a long time, there was always a joke that I didn't cry. And I really didn't. Like, I never cried probably until like, you know, like 5, 10 years ago. Now I cried everything. Because I've been able to do the work and move through and understand that it's okay, no matter what the feelings are, it's okay. Of course, there's lower vibrating feelings and higher vibrating feelings, but that cognitive diffusion and being capable of feeling your feelings, and if they are negative or you don't want to sit in certain feelings, then being intentional about doing things to help you shift how you want to feel, but you have to take that action. um oh my gosh, you said so much good stuff. You talk about kind of you're talking a lot about that self-doubt, that crippling self-doubt, that am I worthy? And especially in women, you describe that in this book, that women of narcissistic mothers in particular, because of the self-doubt, the not getting validation, nurture, empathy, all of a lot of different components. And we can maybe go back and talk about kind of what you call the 10 stingers. But ultimately, you talk about how women will choose two different paths, either the overachiever or the self-sabotager. Can we talk a little bit about both of those and how they play out for people in these situations or scenarios?
Well, what I found in my research is, and then it just kept getting validated in talking with clients over many years, is that people tend to internalize the I am not good enough and I'm valued for what I do for you, the parent, rather than who I am as a person, because that's the mantra of the narcissistic family. You're valued for what you do, not for who you are. And I found about it sort of went 50-50, and it still seems to be that way. Some would internalize the message and say, well, let me show you what I can do. And then they turn into that Mary Marvel where it's achieve, 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 trying to be worthy and trying to be good enough to gain that approval and gain that love, even for themselves to feel worthy. And then there was another large percentage of people that I found who internalized the not good enough message and went the other way and became self-saboteurs. And a lot of those people are not achieving. You'll find, maybe in having addiction struggles or more economic struggles, or finding that they're self-sabotaging their beauty in some way. And then I also always throw out the caveat that I think all adult children of narcissists self-sabotage a little anyway, because it sort of reflects that lack of sense of worth.
Mm.
Do I really deserve? Do I really deserve?
Yeah, and I really encourage you to read this book and tap into that, because self-sabotage isn't always necessarily exactly what you think. You even put in some really great examples that people might not think are self-sabotage, but they actually are. Because maybe it's not necessarily going down a path of drugs or financial ruin, right? But it's sometimes just those little small decisions that we make that are stemmed from that deeply rooted, am I worthy? Am I good enough? What's interesting for me was you give so many examples from real life experiences and real life people. And again, there's a lot that I could relate to. And one of them is, and I talk about this in other scenarios and situations. So when I left my ex, part of the reason why I was so hesitant to date him to begin with is because he has 2 kids. And for me, I never wanted to be a mom. I kind of toyed around with it back and forth, but I always had those questions of, am I going to be like her?
Yeah.
Will I be good? Can I even do it? Will I be a good mom? Will I be terrible at it? So because I'm probably just going to be bad at it, it's probably genetic. I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah.
And now, having gone through what I've been through, and you had some, clients that had a similar experience and, went down that same road. I
Yes.
really believe that part of the reason why I had that relationship and these kids came into my life is because every kid deserves unconditional love from 2 parents.
Yeah.
And I feel like those kids deserve that. And even though he and I are not together, those kids are still in my life. I am still in their lives. I repeatedly tell them, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving. I will always be here. I will always love you.
That's
And
one.
yeah, thank you. And it's not about me, right? But I think that was like a very big aha moment for me only a little over a year ago, where I put together that concept of this is the meaning of this, situation for them and why I think I came into their lives.
Yeah. And it's surprising how many women I talk to who had a narcissistic parent who do make a decision not to have children. That's actually more common than people think. And the reason that they give is just what you just said. Like, what if I would harm a child in the way that I was harmed? Um, and it brings me to kind of a funny story, because when I was writing the first book, Will I Ever Be Good Enough? I came to this part where I was talking about the love relationship issues. And I was talking about, like, well, what do you do if your partner tells you you're acting just like your mother, your narcissistic mother? And all of a sudden, my fingers just like took off, on the keyboard. And I type in, well, then you would have to tell him that you'll kill him. you're going to bury him under a piece of concrete in the basement, upon which you'll place a bed and take on many new lovers. And then I'm like, whoa, that was a trigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sort of, I mean, in a nutshell, just sort of tells you how that's a big issue for women, and it's also why I call our recovery ending the legacy of distorted love. And because we didn't learn what real love is in a narcissistic family, we learn a distorted notion of love. We learn that love is about what you can do for me or what I can do for you. And that's not love,
No.
So for people out there listening who do have children, I mean, that's one of the best reasons for recovery. So we're not passing on this legacy of distorted love.
What's interesting, thank you for sharing that. And I love that. I love how you phrase that, like ending that. What did you call it?
Legacy of distorted love.
Ending the legacy of distorted love. And I'll tell you, even when I was in that relationship, when you are, especially like a step parenting type role, can be additionally challenging because here you're stepping in, and then I'm trying to co-parent with one healthy parent and one extremely narcissistic parent, and that's who I live with. And you kind of have to go along with their parenting style. Additionally, at that point, I was nowhere even in the beginning of my trauma recovery.
Yeah.
So I did have unhealthy coping mechanisms and behaviors. Like there's one instance that I know the oldest still, probably if we were to sit down and have a conversation about it, it was terrible. I gave them the cold shoulder. That was what I learned, was what you did to children when they misbehaved. And I would never do that now. Like now we talk about things, and if there is something, we talk about the reason why. And but we do sometimes then develop those unhealthy coping mechanisms. So sometimes I go, well, gosh, thankfully I didn't have children and I get to have these kids in my life in the very best way possible. But it is a learning journey, and to have that self-reflection, right? Like narcissists don't have that self-reflection. They can't take accountability or ownership for their mistakes either, and, learn and grow from them. So it's a really interesting journey. I think that's a big part. And I'm really glad that you shared that's how common it is, that you see that in, your patients that are adult children of narcissists, because I think that's really validating for people. So speaking of learning things, okay, you and I joked a little bit before about how some of the stories were so eerie reading them. Like some of the stories and the tactics and the, behaviors are almost like textbook. It's like there's a textbook. So I just have to tell this really quick funny story that was like a big aha pivotal moment for me. On page 63, there is a story about you, because I think on that part, what you were talking about was the bond between the daughter and the father. And I relate to that. Like my dad unfortunately passed away almost exactly 3 years ago now, and he was my guy. Like my dad and I were everything. And that's a lot of, like, if I look back, there's always a lot of talk about how my mom was jealous of me and my relationship with my dad, and I took attention away, and all of those components. But there was always the story that was told about when I was a little girl that I told an adult to put, like, my cousin or my nephew or somebody, a child that was a little younger than me, well, just put him down and let him walk. And it was always this thing that everybody joked and laughed about. And there's a story in this book where the mom told the dad to just put the
Yep.
daughter down and let her walk.
Mhm.
And I had like this, I just got goosebumps on my whole body, like a meditative experience, like with my inner child that was like, I had to have heard that somewhere
Yeah. Hmm.
for that to be a repeated story. And so anyway, I wanted to share that with you because it was so fascinating, just in relation to how we talk about, or how we were talking about, a lot of the stories and experiences are very, very similar.
Mhm. It is, it's really interesting. It I mean, you can have many different contexts of people's lives, different socioeconomic contexts and different backgrounds and different histories. But so the external world can look very different for adult children, but we all tend to wave the same emotional banner, meaning we tend to carry the same symptoms and characteristics of being adult children. And that has been interesting, Ginny. In fact, another quick story, when I was writing Will I Ever Be Good Enough, that checklist that you mentioned in the beginning, that I have in the book, I wrote that in 5 minutes. Like that just poured out of me. And it's been edited to sound a little better, word change here and there, but it hasn't changed. And it's been validated by so many clients and readers and interviewees over the years. That was just a raw adult child experience, I guess. You know what I mean?
That is fascinating. And I think what's fascinating about that, so even if you just get the book for this checklist, it's seriously incredibly helpful. It's on page 15. And it just talks about how it helps you have a better understanding of the scope and the scale, right? Because, like you said, narcissism is a scale. It's like this, there's kind of this pendulum. And it helps you understand the level. I won't say what I scored on mine, but it was a lot. So, and I think no matter where you fall on it, it just helps you it helps you get a better understanding. And knowledge is power, right? Like gathering that information and getting curious can really help you on your own journey of healing and recovery. And I love that you call it recovery. I've kind of started to shift my talk. Like I always say like trauma healing, but I really love trauma recovery because I feel like it's an ongoing journey, especially when you are staying active in it. It helps you keep yourself in check when you do have unhealthy coping mechanisms and behavior creep up, or old versions of yourself kind of creeping in. It helps you when you're in that recovery mode all of the time. It kind of helps you stay more true to yourself and continue that journey of growing.
Mhm.
Okay, so you talked a lot in the beginning about how being a child of a narcissistic parent, it's about what you do, not who you are. And this example that you give is so profound. You say, how many of these bumper stickers have we seen? Where are the bumper stickers that say, my kid has a big heart? My kid is honest. My kid is kind.
Mhm.
I
Right? Instead of the honor roll student or the best soccer player in the world or the best ballet dancer in the world. Like those are all great. Those are great things. I would never say don't praise your children for their accomplishments. But yeah, who they are is what's really important.
I'm proud of you. Like that is one thing that I've really tried to incorporate into my vernacular with they call me their bonus mama or B mama. So I call them my bonus kids now. But like that's one of the things that I try to incorporate. Or when they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to go out for X sport this year and I'm already getting really good at it." And their mom and I, like, so we have like this modern family. We get together, the four of us, all the time. We do vacations together. We do holidays together. Her and I have a really great relationship. Like, we're getting together next week. We see each other probably at least once a month. We talk all the time. And her and I are very aligned. So, like, when she hears me talking to them, she knows I'm being really intentional about the things I say. So, like, for example, this summer, one of them had gone out for a new sport and they went to camp and they were talking about, how they really picked it up so fast and they're just going to be so good. And I was like, are you having fun? Are you
Yeah.
enjoying yourself? Are you
Exactly.
doing it because you like it? And I could see her in my peripheral vision nodding, like, yes, like this, these are the conversations we need to be having with these kids because it's not just all about looking good. It's not all about image and being the best at everything. Like life is to be enjoyed, doing things that you're good and being kind and being honest and having a big heart. Those are the things that we should be celebrating. And so that, like, I loved how you put that into context. So thank you for putting that in there. And I think for people that, maybe are ones that have experienced being a child of a narcissist, or just if you have kids, like that, I think is such a beautiful life lesson from
Yeah,
Dr. McBride.
it's very easy, as you know, to focus on, did you clean your room? Did you do your chores? Did you, eat all your nutritious food that I gave you? Did you take your shoes off when you were supposed to? I mean, just all the things we're constantly telling children to do, but completely forgetting, like, to notice, like, you know what? I really loved how you smiled at your friend. I really loved how you dealt with your friend when your friend was sad. I really like how you helped your brother today. I I really love that you're being really honest about, this particular thing we're talking about. Or I love your energy, or I love your motivation, or you inspire me as a little person, you know? Yeah, I love going to your basketball games, I love it.
Yes. Not because it's magnanimous of them to take the time out of their day and their schedule and show up in a big fur coat and, make all the attention about them, but just being there and showing up and supporting them for being who they are and doing something that they enjoy and being seen, right? Being seen and heard. That's so important for kids. That was so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that and putting some additional context. So I don't want to go too far into the 10 stingers. I'll let people explore that in the book because that might be a little like triggering for some people. I want to focus a little bit more on the recovery journey because I think that's like the feel good stuff. We've talked a little bit about some of the symptoms, shared some stories, which I think is really helpful. But you talk about the steps in recovery, which is really important, like the acknowledgement piece, right? Like just the acknowledgement and the understanding. I also appreciate how you put it in a context of not blaming. Like there's no blame, like only you can control your recovery journey, which I thought was great.
Mhm.
And you're so open-minded and you give a lot of options for people on their journeys. But can we talk about the self-care component for a second? Because I think you put a lot of emphasis on that in the book. Can you talk about what that can look like for people while they're going through this, recovery journey?
Well, I think there's just so much to say. I could talk for hours about that. Um, so we gotta pare down my brain here for a second. Because I've designed a 5-step recovery program, which is what I take people through. And it's talked about in all 3 of my books, more refined in my new book, Will the Drama Ever End? Um, and all through those 5 steps, it's all about taking good care of ourselves, because recovery is really an inside job. It isn't about, I'm going to go to the narcissist in my life and ream them out and have it out with them and tell them how they hurt me and, get this off my chest, because it gets people nowhere. Because as you said earlier, narcissists are not accountable, and they're not going to necessarily take it on and say, yeah, you're right, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. So our work is internal, completely internal. And it's not, if it's based on blame, and this is why I talk about, this isn't about rage and hate, anger, blame. if people get stuck there, I mean, we have to be all those things in the beginning, to work on our trauma. But then we have to work our way out of it, because if we get stuck in blame, then we're not going to really be able to finish recovery. And then to say a little more about the self-care, Ginny, one thing I discovered in my work with people, because I, like many therapists, like to talk about self-love and self-compassion because it's so important, you know. But it sounds so cliche and it sounds so therapy talk. And most people are like, what are you talking about? What do you mean by that? And what I came to is, honestly, people can't do that until they have accomplished what we call self-acceptance. Because if I haven't worked on accepting myself for not only my strengths, but my weaknesses, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and really accepted that this is who I am, I'm not going to be able to do self-love and self-compassion, because inside there's always going to be that voice, but remember that? Remember when you said that? Remember when you did that? So it's more complicated than the classical, therapy talk about you're supposed to, you got to love yourself, you got to have self-compassion. Yeah, you do, but it's more involved than that.
Well, it's easier said than done. And I think in the book, you talk a little bit about being careful to not swing the pendulum too far, where you become overly consumed with yourself, right? And only, like everything can have that pendulum that can swing a little bit too far. So I also have a coaching model. It's called Gin Path. There's 3 components. The G is for gathering, and part of that is that self-acceptance and self-discovery component, right? It's turning that lens inward, gathering information about yourself, getting curious about the people around you, about your own situation and scenario. Then you have to be really intentional with that information that you get, that you gather. And then the N, so I take the word self completely out of it and I call it nurture.
Mm-hmm.
And nurture is really that all-encompassing component of caring for yourself, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, intellectually, physically, all of those different ways that you just talked about, right? Like it can be, consuming nutrient dense foods and moving your body and, loving yourself, but you have to know yourself
Mm-hmm.
first before you can love yourself. And when you're a child of a narcissistic parent, a lot of times there isn't that connection to your true authentic self because you're, for a lack of a better word, in some ways a puppet.
That's right. Right.
And so it can take a long time. I mean, for me, it was till I was almost 40 years old to really truly understand myself. And I think people thought that I was confident and strong, but I wasn't. I just had this false sense of armor around me that was like a protective mechanism.
A
I was
lot of people
tough.
talk about it as the imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
I feel like a fraud, if I'm, doing this or doing that, because again, they haven't been validated properly in the growing up phases and the emotional development phases. So then you say, well, you should love yourself. And people are like, if you only knew, right? And so that self-acceptance is a very big part of our recovery, because another dynamic of the narcissistic family, or led by a narcissist, is perfectionism. Because again, if we go back to that perfect image of the perfect family, there's a very strong mantra from this family to be what we want you to be perfect. And as we know, I don't know anyone who's perfect. Do you? Uh,
No.
it's not, I don't think that's possible. And so everybody's going to have some warts, some weaknesses. That's just being human. We're on this human journey together, and we get to be authentic, and we get to be human, and we don't have to be perfect. And that's a big part of our self-acceptance.
That was one of the notes that I wrote to talk to you about. So you basically already just summed it up beautifully. But you talk about reframing and reframing your life, your experiences. That's freedom. And that's where you find your authentic self. And I talk about this. I'm so glad that you did bring up CPTSD because I think that's so validating for people. And I really think this book helps women and people achieve post-traumatic growth, which is such a beautiful gift, to find your purpose, find your authentic self. And part of the recovery, you also talk about journaling and how helpful that is. Can you share a little bit about that? I'm passionate about it too. My second book is a guided journal. And so I obviously believe in that as well. But I think it's always great to hear from a doctor like yourself that has put together programs and has helped many, many people through this trauma recovery.
Yes, I think I focus a lot on journaling, like taking each step, and I have a lot of journaling exercises, more so in my third book, but because it's important that we process the trauma. So there are different ways to process trauma. One is to talk about it and really feel it as we're talking about it. It's not just tell your story, because that doesn't get you anywhere. But it's feel the feelings, let yourself go there and deal with those feelings, embrace those feelings. And so talking about it, feeling it is one part of processing trauma. I think journaling is another way for us to process trauma because it's cathartic, let's get these feelings out somewhere. So they're
Mm-hmm.
not just spinning around in our heads and ruminating and creating internalized messages. So yeah, I think journaling can be very helpful. And it can also be helpful to see if you start journaling in the beginning of your journey and keep going, to sort of see how far you've come also. And
Yeah.
if you are working with a coach or a therapist, it can also be helpful to take that to your sessions and say, this came up this week, this memory came up, or these feelings came up, and I want to continue to work on this.
Yeah, and having those notes as and that journaling as a reference, like you said, so you can track your progress. I think that's a beautiful thing and it is cathartic. Like there's scientific data that shows the benefits of putting pen to paper and
Mhm.
actually writing those things down. It helps you also, like you said, process those thoughts so that they're not just ruminating around in your head. Because I like to say the world is big, but it's not the biggest world. Sometimes the biggest world is our heads and the thoughts that are swirling around in there that are taking up all that space in that room in our lives. It's like that's the story might seem small, but it can still lead to some big trauma for us. So, and those words that we tell ourselves really matter. Okay, so we have talked about this. Seriously, go get this book, order it. I got it, I think, off of Amazon. It's probably available everywhere, but it is so good. And even though, like you said, it came out in 2008, it's timeless. It is so relevant, beautiful, eloquently done. It's so validating. Do the checklist. It's wonderful. But this isn't your only book. So, like you said, you also have Will I Ever Be Free of You? And will the drama ever end? Oh my gosh. Can we just talk about how narcissists say that they don't like drama, but all they do is stir up drama?
Right. I know.
Ah,
And yes, I'm glad you brought up the third book, because that's really where the recovery work is most refined, and the journaling that we're talking about. But yeah, the drama is interesting. And I think it is because a narcissists like attention. So, if no one's noticing, let's stir up some drama, right? And also narcissists aren't really in touch with their own feelings. They're not embracing their own feelings. So they project them onto other people. So if I'm a narcissist and I'm feeling angry, and I'm not really dealing with it, I'm going to be like, Ginny, why are you so dang angry today? And you're going to be like, what? Where did that come from? So there's this projection going on that sort of throws everybody off.
And if
Um,
you weren't angry when they said that you were angry, in probably about 5 minutes, that conversation is going to make you angry.
right, exactly. You're like, what? Where'd that come from? Yeah, but the drama, yes. And as we know, people who don't work recovery don't necessarily get better. So the drama keeps going, and it can be not genetically necessarily passed down. I don't think we have enough research to say that, but passed down in the generations, because if people aren't doing recovery, they're doing what they've learned,
Yeah.
that gets passed down to their children and the next generation. And um, the drama continues.
That's so, it's so interesting to hear you say that because I love bringing on experts like you to really share the clinical side of what you see. And I have another psychologist that's been on a couple of times. She's been really popular as well. And she said that almost like it's very likely if there is a narcissistic parent in the household and there's two children, oftentimes, like, it's very, very common for, and I feel like this is kind of what you just described. It's common for one of the children to learn those behaviors and take on the narcissistic tendencies, and then that other child to kind of take the brunt of the narcissistic abuse. And when we had that conversation, I was like, "Did you just describe my childhood? You just described my upbringing." But it makes a lot of sense just based on what you described in a very similar way. Like, unless you break the patterns and you start to learn to see what is coming up and you become aware and acknowledge it and begin to process it, they can, they can keep repeating themselves until you break that.
Yeah. And I talk quite a bit in my third book about the dynamics of the narcissistic family, and how the children often, you'll see the scapegoat, you'll see the golden child, you'll see the lost child. And that may be what was being described before. And sometimes it's true, a child can take on narcissistic traits, particularly more common in what we call the golden child, in the dynamics of the narcissistic family.
Mhm.
The golden child is the one who will be more bonded with the narcissist, because they're more accepted to the narcissist, basically.
Mhm.
Then it becomes more difficult for that child to individuate and become their own person. So in the end, it's not that great to be the golden child either.
Okay, so I want to ask you this because you're talking about in Will the Drama Ever End? You give even more context about the familial dynamics of each kind of individual. I think this was well done in here. It actually gave me some insight because you even talk about then the spouse. And
Mhm.
it kind of, I mean, like we always just would say that, like, oh, our parents were, codependent on one another and interdependent. But it, like, even just how you share some context about the person married to the narcissist is really fascinating. It kind of, I mean, it made me feel kind of bad, kind of bad for my dad and the role that he would play into it too. It just, the context is fascinating.
Yeah. And we now sometimes we see two narcissistic parents. That's not as common, but we see it. But typically we have the narcissist, and then we have the enabling parent. And the enabling parent is kind of orbiting around the narcissist all the time, making excuses for them, or, kind of backing them up in their dishonesty or their manipulation or whatever the narcissist is trying to do. And that kind of leaves the children over here unattended emotionally because all the focus is on the narcissist. Yeah, and the enabling parent sometimes will come to a realization that, this isn't healthy and this isn't good for my children, and sometimes they don't. So in recovery, oftentimes adult children will have to first do the work related to the narcissistic parent, and then also do the work related to the enabling parent, because the question is out there, why didn't you protect me? Why didn't
Mm.
you take care of me?
Yeah, it's interesting because I did feel like for me personally, I felt unconditionally loved from my dad. Like we were very, very bonded, but I used to wish that my parents would get divorced.
Yeah.
And no, like kids don't generally wish for that. Like they want a united family, they want a united front. But I was like, can I just get out of here and just go live with my dad? Like I remember having those thoughts and
Mhm.
those feelings. But Jim, if you're in a situation like that where you're like, okay, maybe I'm married to a narcissist, it's like you have to weigh your your options of co-parenting with them under one roof, or then, like I know the kids, my bonus kids, their mom would describe when they first split up, her and their dad, my ex, it was they would go to his house for a couple of days and it would take her 5 days to undo the
Mhm.
2 days that they were with him, right? So that creates other whole challenges for people to try to navigate to, through as well. And it's at that
Mhm.
point you have to make the best decision for yourself and your life and your kids and, how that all plays out.
Right.
We could open up a whole nother can of worms on that. Look at you nodding your head, Dr. Karyl McBride. I bet you deal with that a lot, right? So you can understand. I do have a podcast episode, Jem, if you're in that situation right now, with Dr. Tanya Holthus in season 1. It's called Validation for Children of Narcissists and Co-parenting with Narcissists. So, kind of in this same topic vein, but really focusing on that co-parenting component. But okay, so Will the Drama Ever End? That is out and available now for people to get, correct?
Right.
Okay.
And it's out in hardcover and audio, which I narrated. The paperback is coming, and Kindle is out. It's the paperback, however, is coming out March 26th.
Okay. So next month, we've got March 26, 2024. Will the Drama Ever End is coming out in paperback. You can get it today in hardcover, audiobook, and Kindle version. I will link that. If you're a paperback person, look for that next month. And any final thoughts or words that you want to leave us here today? And before you do, I just want to thank you. Thank you for your compassion, your empathy, your helping people, especially women of narcissistic mothers, on their trauma recovery journeys. And I just appreciate the passion that you have for this work. So thank you. With
Thank,
that,
thank
any
you.
final thoughts? Yes, that you want to leave us with?
I would just maybe throw out my book website where anything we've talked about today, you can see all of our resources. And that is at willieverbegoodenough.com. And that will have all 3 of my books and our workshops that we have, our virtual workshops, and some of our other resources for people who really are invested in recovery. And Ginny, I wanted to also thank you, because it looks like you're doing some great work out there, and there's such a need all over the world. I was really surprised when Will I Ever Be Good Enough came out, that there was interest in other countries, that this is not just America. I think we have like 22 foreign translations of that book. So this went worldwide. This is an issue that really really rang some bells for people.
Yeah,
Um,
it's really an epidemic if we think about it, and so many people are impacted by it. And I am passionate about it. That is why we're here. I want to raise awareness. And I know a lot of these words are thrown around really flippantly, right? Like we hear narcissist, and I even joke about it from stage when I'm giving keynotes. I'm like, look, we hear these words like gaslighting, and it was the Merriam-Webster 2022 word of the year. And even Taylor Swift sings about triangulation and narcissism. And he's a narcissist, she's a narcissist. And maybe you've even wondered, am I the narcissist? And if you have wondered that, you're probably not. Uh, but, that's why I like to bring on experts like you that can really give us the deep understanding and tools if you have been in these situations and scenarios to come out better on the other side. That's what it's really all about.
yes, and I would end my part of this by just saying recovery is really worth it.
I concur. So thank you. We will end it on that. The recover is really worth it. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jenny.